Section 2. Personal Recovery Stories. Amy's story. Like so many of us, I grew up never being taught what to do with my feelings, raised by parents who were never taught what to do with theirs. And like so many of us, trauma scarred my young life. I experienced those traumas alone, with no tools except the ability to compartmentalize my feelings and fragment myself. It is no surprise that when I discovered drugs and alcohol at the age of 13, it felt like an epiphany. Here was the perfect way to run from myself, to numb my pain, to create what felt like a safe little world all my own where no one could touch me. And even when they did touch me, I couldn't feel it. Right from the start, I loved using alone. That was my preferred way of getting high, although of course I also did it socially. I would also get high secretly and not tell anyone, sitting there surrounded by people feeling like a ghost. But what I loved most was sitting in my room by myself, convincing myself that this place I created inside my head was the real world, and the one outside, the one full of people in pain, was just an illusion. The first time I went to rehab, I was 16, driven by a depression that no amount of drugs seemed to improve. I wanted it to work, and I approached sobriety like the straight A student I was. But after a year and a half, I was lonelier than ever, and I convinced myself that I could drink and use like a normal person. Not even 2 years later, I dropped out of my dream college, addicted to cocaine, suffering severe mental health issues, and wanting to die. By the time I finally got sober at age 28, I had spent years eking out a life despite myself. I hit a few bottoms on my way there, but somehow I ended up with a promising career, a nice partner, and a house. As always, I lived a double life, my troubled inner world hidden by my armor of privilege and accomplishment. But I was so tired. I had tried in vain for years to control my drinking and drug use, doing all the things we do to lie to ourselves. I managed to quit drugs, but I would always drink again, not knowing what else to do with the feelings that would inevitably come up, the discomfort I had no idea how to sit with. I went to rehab again and threw myself into AA. I was lucky to have gotten sober in the Bay Area, where the 12-step community was diverse and progressive, where it was possible to find a cozy niche of women's and queer meetings that felt like home, where they didn't say the Lord's Prayer, and where their approach to the program and the big book was more trauma-informed and less dogmatic than many other places. For the first time in my life, I felt like I found my people, and I began finding myself. I learned how to be close to people. I learned how to take responsibility for my actions, and I learned that my actions affected other people. Somehow that had never occurred to me. I had been so consumed by my own pain for so much of my life. In some way, I had started to believe I was the only one who felt anything. I had a good early recovery in 12 steps, and I am grateful. In my first few years, I also started exploring Buddhism, going to a day-long retreat and a few meditation groups here and there, reading everything I could find about a Buddhist approach to the 12 steps. I thought I, and my program, were invincible. At 5 years sober and a mother to an almost 1-year-old, my partner and I decided we were done with city living and moved across the country to the mountains of North Carolina. I had always been good at moving, running from problem to problem, and starting over somewhere else. But this time, I wasn't running from something, or so I thought. My life in the Bay Area had been wonderful, but I was ready to start the next chapter of my life. Something was missing, and I thought I would find it in this unfamiliar place surrounded by strangers. But it didn't go quite as planned. I had expected to just fall into 12 steps here and find a new friend group like I did back in California. But the meetings were weird, full of a Southern Christian God and what seemed like questionable recovery. The old-timers sounded like cult leaders. The repetition of readings and sayings and slogans began to wear thin. With the stress of a young child and a huge life transition, and without the community we had back in the Bay, the cracks in my marriage also started to show. I was lonely in North Carolina, and the foundation of both my recovery and my personal life was starting to feel shaky. Then I found a flyer on a coffee shop bulletin board for a Buddhist recovery group, and I decided to give it a try. The meeting was just a handful of quirky-looking people sitting on cushions in a circle on the floor, talking about their lives in what felt like a refreshingly intimate and authentic way. I immediately felt like this was the room I wanted to be in. Over the next several months, I found a home in this new community. I began to see my personal growth with a Buddhist lens, addiction as something much deeper than a dependency on chemicals or even a disease. Yearning was the human condition, and we addicts, through whatever concoction of trauma and adverse childhood experiences and hereditary influences, came to feel these yearnings more intensely, often for things beyond substances. Buddhism deepened my recovery in ways I never imagined possible in 12 steps, inviting me to not only look outward at systems created by others, but ultimately look inward and trust my own wisdom. That is not to say I think I know all the answers. I certainly knew very little about how to live an honest and healthy life when I got sober, and I needed to look outward for wisdom, to trusted groups and people who I knew had something valuable to teach me. I believe being humble is essential to wisdom. But as my recovery deepens, so does my trust of my ability to make healthy choices, and to also know when I need help figuring out what those healthy choices are. It is easy for me to focus solely on the inward-looking aspects of Buddhism and convince myself sometimes that this is a solitary path. But there is a reason sangha is one of the 3 jewels at the core of this path, and I know I cannot do this alone. It is easy for me to make Buddhism complicated, to over-intellectualize, but I also know that I feel most grounded when I focus on just being with experience rather than judging or analyzing it. When in doubt, I remind myself of the core teaching, do no harm. I remind myself that includes not doing harm to myself. Buddhist recovery has taught me the importance of being kind and gentle to myself. It has taught me to look at my intentions and motivations for doing things. It has helped me understand that I can find peace regardless of what is happening outside of myself, and that I do not need external validation to feel that I am enough. And I am finding that the more I feel that I am enough, the less I crave other things to fill me up. When we started Recovery Dharma, one of our core intentions was to emphasize that this is a program of empowerment, not powerlessness. Acceptance of what is part of equanimity and integral to our liberation, but that is not the same as powerlessness. As a writer, I know that words matter. As a survivor of trauma amongst so many other survivors of trauma, I know that powerlessness is not what I want my recovery to be based on. Instead, I see my recovery as a path towards wholeness and embodied, empowered choices. I may not always have power over what happens in the world, what happens to me, or even my own feelings, but I have power in how I choose to respond. Sometimes that power is limited by old patterns and trauma response, but it is still there. My Buddha nature, my liberation, is always inside me, always accessible. I have the power to be kind and gentle to myself and others. I have the power to set boundaries and also to forgive. I have the power to look at my various human yearnings and discern what is motivated by craving versus what is motivated by curiosity, connection, and joy. I have the power to be present and breathe through whatever life brings me and to be grateful for all of it.